September 14, 1945. 6 weeks after the war's final surrender. In a frost-stiff compound outside Nottingham, 23 silent women huddled in thin blankets. For men who'd watched friends burn and drown, the first reaction was not procedure. It was an old, animal curiosity. The guards were young, hollow-eyed, months away from home. When the door opened, something complicated and fragile crossed the threshold. Not paperwork, but the dangerous human pull between people who had been taught to hate each other. When the door opened at 05:42 on September 14th, the first thing most of the men saw was not a file or a crime, but a face. Young, narrower than the coarse faces of the front, eyes that had learned to read danger in a flash. The soldiers had been away from home for years. Many had not seen a woman who wasn't a ration queue or a hospital orderly in months. The look between them was immediate and awkward, curiosity thick as mud, shame thin as paper. A private who'd lost a brother in '44 tried to hide a smile and instead stammered when a girl brushed the splintered doorframe with her palm. No procedures yet, only the human reflexes of men who'd been taught to kill, but not to return to ordinary kindness. The first bartered intimacy was small and utterly ordinary. A cigarette passed at the threshold. Soldiers who'd rationed tobacco for months loosened their grip and offered smokes with hands that trembled less than their voices. The women accepted or refused as they chose. Some took it like a lifeline. Others refused with a clipped no that was a small armor. The exchange was mercantile and human at once. Two desperate economies meeting. Private Tom, who'd been at Monte Cassino, found himself talking in jokes about weather. The woman replied in halting English and laughed, not because it was funny, but because the act of laughing felt like a claim on being alive. The men discovered that attraction often began in the space between offering and acceptance. Many soldiers caught themselves holding a gaze and then quickly looking away, as if embarrassment could pull them back from feeling. Attraction came with guilt. A soldier had lost mates to shelling the week before. To feel tender in that moment felt like betrayal. Yet tenderness persisted in small gestures, smoothing a blanket edge from a bunk, straightening a threadbare sleeve, handing over a spoon without looking anyone in the eye. The women, in turn, sometimes met the look and sometimes tested it. A deliberate smile, a tilted chin, the slow offering of a name. These were not declarations of love, but an exploration of whether human affection could exist across barbed wire and orders. That afternoon, someone found a battered record and a gramophone. Music, a tune from before the war, filled the yard like warm smoke. The melody loosened tongues. A corporal who'd never been able to say his name to a stranger found himself describing the song's city of origin. A young woman hummed the chorus as if to anchor it in English syllables. The men pressed closer, not to seize, but to learn language, to map another life with syllables and notes. There was a whisper then, low and mutual. Where are you from? Do you have family? The questions were human, the answers partial, but the exchange made clear that attraction often sought an explanation, a way to humanize the other to avoid the easy brutality war permitted. Smiles became risky politics. The camp had rules and officers who enforced them, yet the day's sergeants were tired and sometimes looked the other way when a man lingered by a bunk to tie a bootlace or fold a blanket. These small acts were not seduction so much as humanizing rituals. One soldier pretending to mend a torn sleeve, while another taught a woman to boil coffee without making it bitter. The women answered in guarded kindness. Where consent existed, it was one-sided in vulnerability, but mutual in choice. A woman choosing to give a small kindness in return, a man choosing to offer it. The dynamic was messy and honest. Attraction that acknowledged its danger and chose, often stubbornly, to be gentle. By night, conversations grew quieter and brave. Men who had seen rivers of blood spoke loudly no longer. Instead, they listened to a woman describe a meadow where she'd once danced, or the name of a child she might never see again. The attraction that began with a look and a cigarette matured into a protective impulse for some. Not ownership, but a refusal to see the other as only an enemy. The soldiers' hands stayed mostly empty. The women's bodies remained their own. Where warmth offered itself, it did so in shared stories, in the deliberate passing of a patch of blanket, in the honest admission that longing existed even in uniforms. These are the first human notes of what would become a complicated aftermath: attraction, restraint, and the fragile duty to keep one another humane. Winter tightened its fingers on the camp. Rations were scarce, but men began to share food not as charity, but as an excuse to be near people who weren't corpses or orders. A tin of bully beef turned into a demonstration of care. A soldier, James, spent 20 minutes with an old spoon trying to coax a stew into palatable warmth for a woman who hadn't had hot food in months. The act wasn't heroic. It was clumsy, human. A private offered a spare wool button sewn into a handkerchief. Not romantic jewelry, but a token of usefulness. The women accepted these small offerings with the exact mixture of gratitude and caution you'd expect when power is uneven. One accepts warmth, always aware that the giver can take it away. These exchanges created informal pacts for protection, for a shared cigarette, for an extra serving, that bound people in ways neither command nor treaty anticipated. Language became a bridge less formal than interrogation. Soldiers taught place names and slang. Women taught songs, recipes, a swear word that made the men laugh. The corporal who ran late-night watch learned to ask, "Where from?" in 3 broken syllables, and listened to a woman describe a small riverside village with a willow where she'd once hidden from rain. These exchanges were rarely symmetrical. The men had the language of orders. The women had domestic words that conjured lives. The equalizer was curiosity. Attraction fed this learning. People leaned toward the things that explain their yearning. Over a battered map and a shared cigarette, the men created mental images of places they'd never seen. The women, in turn, tested whether these men could be trusted with names and memories. Trust grew slowly, like frost melting in the spring. One afternoon, a guard with leniency in his bones, Private Tom, escorted a pair of women to sweep a small unused orchard beyond the outer fence. The walk was technically permitted under supervision, but it felt like an act of daring. For the soldiers, it was a break from the barracks routine. For the women, it was a breath of open air. They spoke in fragments, carried sticks to clear fallen fruit, and allowed themselves brief, unguarded laughter when a dog from a nearby cottage ran out to sniff them. Tom noticed how one woman tucked her hair behind her ear the same way his sister had during summers at home. The walk didn't become anything epic. It was an interval in which attraction acquired texture, sense of earth, the weight of a shared basket, the risk of small kindnesses becoming something more. Whispers grew into rumors faster than any officer could stamp them out. The men who had nothing to lose traded stories like currency. Private liaisons, convivial smuggling of extra rations, and the soft claim that she smiled at me. Rumors carried danger because they simplified complex human acts into scandal. Jealousy flickered in the barracks when one soldier was seen carrying a woman's knitted scarf. Some men used rumor to boast, others used it to warn. The women watched these rumors as carefully as the men did, knowing that an ugly rumor could transform a soft moment into violent consequence. Attraction, once private, became a social fact, measured not only by gestures but by what others said about them. This made intimacy tentative and strategic. Lovers who were also prisoners learned to hide the parts of tenderness that could be weaponized.
Command noticed. Major Ellis, a man who read discipline as loyalty, observed the drifting conversations and interpreted them as morale risks. He didn't see the gentleness. He saw potential breaches in order. The major instituted new walk schedules and posted an extra NCO on evening duties. He delivered a rote admonition. Fraternization risks morale and must be prevented. But soldiers are inventive. Rules bend in the face of human need. Some obeyed, others quietly ignored the change in schedule, and a few resented the major's implication that compassion was a failing. The confrontation didn't explode into punishment immediately. Instead, it added pressure, a social strain that made each small kindness feel like a test of courage. When authority begins to police affection, attraction must become furtive or fuel resistance.
At the end of Section 2's week, a carved wooden token changed things. It wasn't a jewel, but a small charm shaped like a boat, whittled by a bored soldier using a pocket knife. He offered it to a woman who'd shown him how to braid hair into a thick plait. In that moment, the token represented something few words could, a request that this fragile human connection survive the next bureaucratic morning. Giving and accepting the charm was a choice with consequences. For him, it meant risking the wrath of command and the scorn of comrades. For her, it meant entering a mutual pact that could either protect or endanger. She took it after a long pause, fingers closing with deliberate consent. Outside, a guard's lamp traced the wire. Inside, a small hope flickered quietly, daring the rest of the camp to extinguish it. A week after the token, the small pacts hardened into routine. Private James, who'd whittled the boat charm, began to make regular runs to the supply tent under the pretense of duty, returning with boiled sugar and extra tea leaves he'd swapped for cigarettes. His gestures were clumsy and constant, smoothing a woman's hair from her brow, pressing the back of his hand to her cheek when she shivered. The acts were public enough to be noticed, but discreet enough to avoid formal reprimand. For the women, the gestures were a fragile currency. Acceptance meant protection. Refusal risked exposure. Love was not yet the right word. It was a promise in a world where promises broke upon contact with official paper. Still, each time James tied a knot in a borrowed scarf, the women read intent into the motion and adjusted their trust accordingly. Jealousy is a soldier's rough cousin. It arrives on the heels of distraction. One afternoon, Corporal O'Neill, a man known for his quick temper and private losses, returned from patrol and found a woman laughing at Tom's clumsy imitation of a village dance. O'Neill's anger pulsed like a live wire. He accused Tom of fraternizing and undermining discipline. For O'Neill, tenderness looked like betrayal. He had buried a fiancée in '44 and believed affection outside bloodlines was a dangerous luxury. The confrontation was more about what he'd lost than what was happening, but his words carried force. Tensions flared, men took sides. The camp's social order, fragile as it was, transformed into factions that watched one another as carefully as they watched the prisoners. A fever swept through the camp one damp night. It struck fast. A woman who'd once laughed at Tom's dance lay burning under a threadbare blanket, the fever making her eyes glassy. The men scrambled to help with what little they had: sugary tea, consciousness checks, and the single medic's salve. It was the test of their promises. James sat through the night, holding her hand and whispering fragments of a future they both knew could not exist. The caring actions were not heroic so much as stubborn, cleaning a fevered brow, rousing her for sips, trading a blanket from his own bunk. Compassion here was messy and real. It demanded sacrifice from men who had too little to give, and it laid bare the unequal stakes. If the woman worsened, she would be exposed to scrutiny, and the men would face blame for having aided her. When the fever reached the sentry post, the guard detail reported what they saw. Aid given, blankets borrowed, extra food offered. The report did not ask why, it simply noted deviations. Major Ellis, who had tightened rules, read the sentry's note with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. He ordered a night watch rotation change and a reminder that fraternization threatened unit cohesion. But the order also revealed bias. He sought tenderness as undermining authority, not as the moral glue holding men together after trauma. His response hardened the social fault lines into policy pressure. Kindness would be surveilled, and the men who had shown it would be forced to explain their small rebellions against the dull brutality of garrison life. Defiance found a new channel: coordination. When guards tightened patrols, the men adapted by creating small codes. An extra cigarette tapping 3 times at the door meant safe to approach. Shifting a foot on the 3rd step meant move closer. These were not theatrical signals, but pragmatic improvisations born of necessity. Women and men organized mid-watch gatherings where a sentry's gaze was diverted while a kettle boiled. Their acts were not secret pleasures so much as covert mutual aid, keeping each other warm, sharing news from the outside, and preserving dignity through routine. The tactical ingenuity of these small pacts showed that human kindness is both stubborn and strategically adaptive in oppressive systems. Then, at the end of the month, a transfer notice appeared on the announcement board. Several detainees would be moved to another facility for reassessment on September 30th, 1945. The news hit like a frost. For those with tokens, songs, and small pacts, it sounded like a calendar-driven foreclosure. Men who had built quiet protectiveness now faced a concrete deadline: either act to preserve the bonds or watch them dissolve as the women were loaded onto transport trucks. Panic and planning broke out in equal measure. Some considered bribery. Others had the bleak idea to plead, but all felt the same raw fear, that intimacy across the wire might be severed by administrative paper. The night before the transfer, everyone moved like people in a dream who know dawn will break the spell. Plans were small and practical. Pass a note to a nurse at the transport depot. Trade a watch for a favor. Tuck a tin with a saved ration into an outer pocket. Men used what leverage they had: lighter cigarettes, a favored joke, a willingness to cover a duty, to thread help into the official channels without asking to be punished. James considered stealing a roster, but realized the risk would wreck many lives if he failed. Instead, he and Tom stitched a plan that relied on plausible deniability. Ask for extra blankets to ship with the detainees. Persuade a soft-hearted driver to slow the convoy at a crossroads. The urgency was not cinematic heroism. It was the practical arithmetic of people trying to keep one another human when bureaucracy tried to make them objects of movement.
Money was scarce, but favors and cigarettes were easier currencies. A driver with a fondness for music could be paid in records. A clerk with a sister needed extra soap. The soldiers bartered, not to corrupt, but to redirect the machine that moved people as if they were inventory. For some men, it felt like theft. For others, it felt like justice. The moral calculus was messy. Hand over a ration card and save a woman you'd started to care for, or keep the card for your own sick father back home. Each choice lodged a small splinter of guilt. The women, when offered such favors, took them with steady hands and a silence that acknowledged the men's risk and the cost exacted on both sides. These transactions were not clean. They left residue, but they were honest about stakes in a world where formal authority often meant blind procedure.
On the morning of the transfer, tension crystallized at roll call. Major Ellis read the movement orders in a voice designed to close the room, and murmurs rose like trapped birds. Corporal O'Neill stepped forward with a complaint, an accusation of fraternization, and his words cut like a blunt tool at the men who had tried to help. The exchange felt less about rule and more about O'Neill's need to assert control over a world that had taken his private grief. James defended the choices he'd made, not with rhetoric, but with simple facts: a blanket given, a bowl shared, a watchful eye. The major, cold and careful, recorded names. No one was arrested that hour, but the official record would later frame kindness as a breach. The moral economy of the camp inverted. Those who had been humane now needed to explain themselves to a ledger that did not know mercy.
Loading was mechanical and deliberate. Women climbed into canvas-sided trucks with their few possessions wrapped in ration cloth. The men lingered at the ramps, hands on the wooden slats, as if to hold the vehicles back. A few slipped a hidden tin of sugar beneath a bundle. Another tucked a faded photograph where a uniform sleeve would not find it. Greta, who'd once pressed herself against the far wall and whispered a prayer, paused and looked straight at Tom. No grand declarations were made, only the clenching of fists and a shared look that contained promises neither paper could bind. The convoy's engines coughed, and a driver, whose sister had once worked in a canteen, idled the truck for an extra breath. The human exchanges at the ramp were all small miracles. A tightened scarf, a whispered name, the press of a palm against a thigh in silent benediction. As the convoy rolled away, the camp felt emptied not only of bodies, but of a certain kind of possible future. Men watched until the trucks were a smudge on the road. Some turned away early to hide tears they could not show. The immediate aftermath was domestic and blunt. Missing mugs at breakfast, a blanket left folded on a bunk, a silence that occupied the space where laughter had been. James found the carved boat token in his pocket, suddenly heavier than wood. The camp did not explode into mass reprisals. Rather, it settled into a hush that allowed for private reckonings. Men writing letters they would never send, others making plans to petition for transfers to follow the women, and a few sharpening rage into purpose. The departure set a clear boundary. Attachment could not stop administrative motion, but it could seed long-lasting obligations and regrets.
Weeks later, a few letters trickled back through informal channels. Short lines, a smudged signature, sometimes only a pressed leaf. A driver sympathetic to Tom's requests mailed a sealed envelope. A clerk smugly returned a cancelled receipt for a small bribe. For some men, the letters were proof that their choices had mattered. For others, they were a reminder of how little control anyone had over fate. The camp changed shape in memory. An entire set of small human economies had flourished between dawn and dusk, and then scattered like seeds on wind. Where love had been possible, it had been cautious, imperfect, and fiercely consensual. Where affection had been refused, it had still taught both sides how to hold themselves with more grace. The final note is not tidy. A stamped date, October 12, 1945, on a letter that reads only, "I remember the boat, keep safe." It is a modest testament to survival, connection, and the messy ways humanity persisted across barbed wire.
When Tom was demobilized on December 16, 1946, he carried more than a uniform home. He carried a carved wooden boat in his pocket and a ledger note from the camp that listed names he could not forget. The Major's record of fraternization had followed him into a thin, bureaucratic inquiry in January 1947, a staccato interview that asked for facts and reduced tenderness to a charge. The hearing ended with no court-martial, but with a censure on his file, a small administrative scar that later closed some doors to promotion and service benefits. For Tom, it was less a punishment than a formalization of the truth he already knew. Kindness can be inconvenient to institutions. What kept him restless was the single letter stamped October 12, 1945. "I remember the boat. Keep safe." It became his map. With a modest discharge payout and 2 friends who owed him favor, Tom wrote to organizations in Britain handling displaced persons and used the few contacts the camp had left him. He learned the slow arithmetic of post-war movement: transfers, repatriation, resettlement lists. It took nearly 2 years of letters, 3 broken postal addresses, and 1 sympathetic driver who remembered the delayed convoy before he finally found Greta's name on a municipal register in Liverpool, March 1948, listed as a displaced woman assigned temporary lodging while awaiting repatriation. Their reunion was quiet and not cinematic. At a small waiting room off the docks, Greta folded and refolded her hands. Tom recognized her by the way she tucked hair behind one ear, just as she had in the orchard. They spoke in halting sentences at first, then in fewer words that carried more weight. She had been through processing centers, horror stories of camps elsewhere, and months of indignity. He had been through patrols, inquiry rooms, and the hollow of a barracks deprived of laughter. They married on June 12, 1949, in a modest registry office. No grand church, no fanfare, because both had learned the value of practical certainty over public praise. The marriage certificate lists Tom's occupation as machinist. He found work in a factory.
the long hours steadying him. Greta trained as a seamstress and mended uniforms for local families, turning skill into livelihood. Long-term consequences were real and unromantic. The censure on Tom's record made long-term military employment unlikely. He lost a chance at a skilled apprenticeship tied to service that men with clean papers received. Community reaction was mixed. Some colleagues admired his stubbornness. A few old men judged him for softening in war's aftermath. Greta faced suspicion and casual cruelty from neighbors who used rumor to explain what they did not want to feel. Attraction between former enemies made their certainties wobble. Yet those same communities relied on Greta's skill and Tom's steady hands when boilers broke or tractors stalled. Practicality often beat ideology. More intimate costs lingered. Tom had nightmares for years, flashbacks to nights in the orchard and the hum of convoy engines. And Greta bore her own quiet recoil, the memory of long trains, the scent of coal, the awkwardness of being treated as an object of curiosity. They navigated these burdens together, Tom learning when to hold silence, Greta learning to ask for touch without fear. Their scaffolding was small kindnesses. He rebuilt his life around family routines. She built hers around income and the small authority of a woman who could make a child's coat last winters. In March 1951, they had a son, David. The boy's birth was messy and glorious, a proof that ordinary things, laughter, bread, scraped knees, could return to a life once fractured. Tom's smallest public consequence turned into private advocacy. He joined a veterans group and quietly pressed for humane treatment of displaced persons, telling his story in small gatherings, not as grand testimony, but as a practical plea to treat people as people. He was never a celebrity for this. Instead, he became the neighbor who signed petitions, the man who pushed for better housing for Greta's friends who stayed in Liverpool. In return, Greta taught sewing classes to other displaced women. The workshop became a refuge where language, technique, and laughter were taught in equal measure. By the end of the 1950s, their marriage had the mark of ordinary endurance. Bills paid, illnesses weathered, grief for lost friends remembered each Remembrance Day. The institutional cost, the censure, the whispered rumors, softened with time but never fully vanished. What remained was clearer, a life shaped by a decision to care when it would have been simpler not to. Their son grew up with a carved boot on the mantel and a handful of letters framed on a wall, the paper edges browned, but the ink stubbornly legible. The letters were modest proofs that small acts, an offered cigarette, a hidden tin of sugar, a carved charm, can reroute lives, sometimes at cost, often with quiet justice. Tom died decades later with his hand stained by factory grease and a photograph of Greta tucked in his wallet. She survived him by a few years, remembered by neighbors as the woman who mended coats and taught children to stitch. Their marriage was not a tidy triumph over history, but a slow human repair, flawed, courageous, and stubbornly compassionate. Exactly the kind of aftermath that begins not with orders, but with the small acts of two people who chose to keep one another human.